All right, we are back in 1 Kings this morning, back in 1 Kings chapter 19, and again in again in chapter 21. So 1 Kings chapter 19, and then we'll get on to chapter 21 as well. We've been talking about Elijah's story. This series is called The Prophets Eli, not because they're named Eli, but because their names start with it. So Elijah and Elisha. And that's really where we're camping out all summer. And so we're telling Elijah's stories. And so that's why we kind of skip over. I'm going to say you could read chapter 20, but chapter 20 doesn't really involve Elijah. And so we're skipping it because it's not Ahab's story, it's Elijah's story. So 1 Kings 19, when we last left Elijah, he was there on Mount Horeb. If you'll recall, God had called him after Elijah had done a little bit of running away. God had kind of sustained him and provided for him and encouraged him, and then called him to go to Mount Horeb because he needed to have a conversation. And so Elijah was there on Mount Horeb in a cave, and God appeared to Elijah. And first there was a mighty wind that tore through the mountain passes, dislodging rocks, and God was demonstrating his power, but he wasn't there in the wind. And then there was an earthquake that shook the rocks. And God was demonstrating his power, but he wasn't in the earthquake. And then there was a fire that scorched the mountainside. God was demonstrating his power, but God was not in the fire. And then God spoke to Elijah in a still, small voice. And he asked Elijah what he was doing here. The obvious answer was, Lord, you told me to be here. Done nursing my wounds, but ready to move on. And so God gives Elijah in that moment a mission to go and find some people. And there in verses like 15 or so, down to verse 19, he goes and tells him to find Elisha and Elihu and Hazael. And he gives him these people and this mission to go find these people and go on. Now, finding people is a mission that God still gives today. There are times and places where God needs people to be found, and he uses people like Elijah, and really like anybody at times, to go and find them. And so this ministry that Elijah has here is a ministry that is very, I don't want to say common, because that has the sound of belittling it, and it's not something to be belittled. It's just something that is normal for God to call people into these types of ministries to find. And so the first person that we see Elijah finding, or the first person we're going to focus on Elijah finding, rather, is Elisha. And we find his story there in 1 Kings chapter 19, beginning in verse 19. Now, when we think about Elisha, I just told you we're going to be doing the stories of Elijah and Elisha. And so you hear in that Elisha is to be Elijah's successor. God has a sense of succession planning. And he gets that. I'm going to turn that down, Chris, because that's starting to drive me nuts. I can only imagine what it's doing to you. I'll turn it down. I'm not going to move. See if that helps. Fans and mics don't always work well together, but either do no fans and Doug's. So we'll see. So God is here calling or appointing Elisha to be the successor to Elijah. So we begin in verse 19 there in 1 Kings chapter 19. So he, Elijah, departed from there and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. Then Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him. So if you can imagine the scene here, Elijah's walking through the countryside, and we get this statement about Elisha plowing with 12 yoke of oxen and him plowing with the 12. There is a lot of information that we actually find about Elisha in those statements, more than you readily appreciate. First of all, during this era, land was oftentimes measured by the number of yoke of oxen it would take to plow that land. So you could have a lot that was the size of one yoke of oxen. And that's a sizable plot, but that you would need a yoke of oxen to plow that plot. And so the more yoke of oxen it would take, and a yoke being two working together, the more yoke of oxen it would take to plow that, the larger the lot of land was. And so to say that he was out plowing with 12 yoke of oxen means this was a large estate, something that it would take 12 teams of oxen to plow this particular piece of real estate. So it's actually a very large lot of land that Elisha and his family have. And so we find in this that Elisha, from a land perspective, is in a wealthy family. To add to that, Elisha is actually out there with 12 yoke of oxen. His family is wealthy enough that they actually own 24 oxen. And in an agrarian culture where you measure wealth in the number of animals that you have and the ability to produce wealth that you have, because essentially, though an ox is an indicator of wealth, it's also a driver of wealth. It is oxen that allow you to plant and to harvest way more than you can consume, creating additional wealth for yourself and your family. So the fact that his family had 12 yoke of oxen, again, is another measure of wealth. Elisha's family had a large piece of land, a lot of oxen that were out there, came from a wealthy family, and a family that had the means to continue to produce additional wealth. This is capitalism 101. It's how it works. And then we find in this also that Elisha was out there plowing, not sending servants, though they had them. He was out there plowing with that 12th team. And so not only was he wealthy, he was diligent. He was a worker bee. He was out there, had a vested interest in continuing to drive and generate the wealth that his family could continue to acquire in farming. And so we find a lot about Elisha. We find a lot about his family. Now, from a human perspective, Elisha was successful. He was part of a successful family. He was driven. He was wealthy. He seemed to have it all together. And many a person in his shoes would have been completely satisfied to spend the rest of their lives in this situation, having and creating wealth, having and purpose and diligence and all of these things. But despite his wealth, God sent Elijah to find Elisha. And the reason that Elijah had to find him was because Elijah had to discover Elisha because he was not who he could be. Despite his apparent success, Elisha was not who he could be. And God knew that there was more in store for Elisha, that Elisha could be more than he was. There was something more than just wealth and drive that awaited Elisha. And so Elijah walks up and he throws his mantle on Elisha. That's kind of an odd scene as well. Despite the oddity to our ears as we read this and hear this, Elisha understood what that meant. Elisha understood that for Elijah to walk by and just throw his mantle, that kind of outer cloak of covering, onto Elisha, he understood the significance of that. And we see that in verse 20. He left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, "Please let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." And he, Elijah, said to him, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" And so we get kind of this gruff answer out of Elijah, but the significance is that Elisha immediately recognizes that this is a call to the prophetic office, and he immediately answers. There's no hesitation. He stops plowing. He runs after Elijah, so there's an immediate following, and then he asks for permission to say goodbye before they continue their journey. He is immediately placing himself voluntarily into a submissive, subservient role. I'm going with you. Can I just say goodbye first? And Elijah's response is gruff. Hey, what have I done to you? And you could really paint that up and play that up like, hey, who cares? You go do whatever you want. But really what we see in Elijah is just that confirmation that this choosing, this calling, this role is voluntary. I haven't done anything to you that can't be undone. I haven't done anything to you that is compulsory. Yes, I'm calling you to the office of a prophet, but it's a voluntary thing. You go do what you need to do. There's nothing I can do that would say, no, you can't go do that. That's really what Elijah is saying, kind of briskly. But, Elijah was kind of a prickly pear anyway, right? And so, so Elisha immediately turns back, and he goes back, and we see it as the verses go on, that he goes back and he actually sacrifices the 2 oxen that he was plowing with. And he takes their tack, and he takes all of the wood that was part of the plow, and he breaks it up, and he starts a fire with it. And he actually roasts the meat of those 2 oxen over the fire that he created from the plow. And then he distributes it to everybody. He throws his own farewell party, basically. Steak for everybody. But what is there then to go back to? And it's the very symbolic act that Elisha does to say, this part of my life, this is over. There is no oxen for me to go back to. There is no plow for me to return to. That's all been destroyed and sacrificed and spread around. That part of my life is over. I'm going to follow Elijah. So he has this farewell party, but Elijah finds Elisha, discovering him because he was not who he could be. And then we fast forward a little bit. Chapter 20 has its own intrigue in the life of Ahab. And we've talked a bit about Ahab. His story is a little bit intertwined with Elijah. It's hard not to. But we find in Ahab really a despicable person. There's no way around it. He was a wicked king who was determined to be wicked, who was determined to do what he wanted to do, not what God wanted him to do. And then he married poorly on top of that, married a woman named Jezebel, who was just a witch in every sense of the word, and who really was just not interested in helping Ahab do anything that was godly. Rather, she had her own agenda of godlessness, of power-mongering, of wickedness. And so she just played to all of Ahab's weaknesses anyway. In 1 Kings 21, we get the story of, we're going to get to anyway, the story of Elijah finding Ahab. But first we have to go through what is the tragic story of Naboth. Naboth was a resident of Jezreel, there in Samaria, lived not far from the palace, unfortunately for him. And we find a day where Ahab, the king, decides that Naboth's property is very close and very appealing, and he's got this vineyard that's very productive, and he wants to buy the property from Naboth or trade him. He'll give him another vineyard somewhere else. He's the king after all. I'll give you a different vineyard. I'll give you money, but I want your vineyard, and I'm going to take your vineyard, and I'm going to pull up all your plants, and I'm going to put in a vegetable garden, an herb garden there. So this is the king's plan. Naboth really does not want any part of this. Naboth, for his part, is actually far more godly than the king. And he says, hey, God forbid that I should give you my property. One of the things that we don't always see in this is that the land of Israel was given to the different families, and it was God's plan that those families should hold that property in perpetuity, that they would always be there for those people. It was a recognition that God was sovereign, that God had given this land to this person and this family, and it was to stay with that person, with that family, generation after generation after generation. It was to be theirs. Now, God knew that, people being people as they are, buy, sell, lose, get in debt. There are a lot of things that we do economically, some of which are smart, some of which are foolish. And God built in plans to make sure that the land would always stay with the family. There was always a right of redemption for any lot of land. If you sold it, it could be redeemed. And then on top of that, every 50th year, they had what was called the year of Jubilee. And the year of the Jubilee, all property reverted back to the families to which it was given originally. And so if you wanted to sell a piece of land, there was two factors you had to consider as a buyer. First was, how much is the land itself worth? And secondly, how close are you to the year of Jubilee? Because at the year of Jubilee, that land was going to revert back to the original owner. And so the amount of value that you would give or offer for that land would increase or decrease depending on how close you were to the year of Jubilee, because when you hit the year of Jubilee, that land reverted back. Your ownership of it just ceased. And so if it was getting close, you would pay a lot less for it because you'd only get a couple years out of it. If you bought it the year after the Jubilee, you were going to get 49 years out of it, then you might pay a little bit more because you're going to get it longer, but you were never going to keep it because it was God who gave the land to the people and to their families, and it was God who wanted that land to continue to be in the hands of those families. And so he set up these mechanisms, and so here's the king asking Naboth to buy this land. And Naboth is like, I am tied to this land. This is the land that belonged to my father and to my fathers before him. This is the land that is my land. This is the land that is to be the lands of my children. This is the land that God has given to my family to stay in the hands of my family. And so he respectfully but forcefully declines the king's offer. Now, Ahab, being the great king that he was, did immediately what all great kings do when their offer to buy a piece of real estate is rebuffed. He went home, he crawled into bed, curled into a fetal position, stuck his thumb in his mouth, and wouldn't move. Full-on royal pout. This is what kings do, right? This is kingly. Well, maybe not. But this is what Ahab did. And Jezebel comes home, and she finds King Ahab curled up into a ball in bed. He's not eating. He's not bathing. Ew. He's not doing anything but sitting there pouting in bed. Now, Jezebel, to her credit in this one, is not really surprised by this behavior, which gives us to believe that maybe this was common on Ahab's part, that maybe he frequently threw temper tantrums and sulked and pouted and, basically behaved like a spoiled 3-year-old. But that's what he's doing. And so she comes in and she's like, hey, what's wrong? And so Ahab explains, the whole thing with Naboth. And she goes, wait a minute. You're in bed pouting because Naboth won't sell you his vineyard. He's like, uh-huh. She's like, aren't you the king? He's like, I think so. Don't you lead and rule over all of Israel? Well, that's kind of what kings do. So why are you here and not just taking what you want? As the king, aren't you entitled to go take whatever you want? That really wasn't an offer. That was a command. That was, hey, would you please sell me your property? And you said, please, to be nice, but the reality is you could have walked in, changed the titleship, thrown a bag of money at his feet, and been done with the whole affair. She goes, you just hang here. Go ahead and keep sulking. I'll take care of this. And so Jezebel's idea of taking care of it was, I'm going to get you this garden for free. So she drafts some letters to the elders of Jezreel, and she signs Ahab's name to them, sends them by messenger to the elders of Jezreel saying, look, here's what I want you to do. I want you to declare a fast for your city, and I want you to gather the people, and I want you to set Naboth in a place of honor. But next to Naboth, I want you to set up these two scoundrels, these two liars, these two people who you can buy off. And at some point very early in the proceedings, I want both of these guys to say, hey, Naboth has just blasphemed God and the king. One of which is a crime, the other one is not so much. And I want both of these guys to say that because, again, under Jewish law, by the mouth of two witnesses, a thing is established. And then I want you to take Naboth out, and I want you to stone him for blasphemy. Classic frame job. This is as tragic as it gets. This is how Jezebel operates, though. So the elders of Jezreel, they declare the fast. They put Naboth in the place of honor. They put these two, these two scoundrels next to him. And very early on, they go, hey, this guy just blasphemed God and the king. And they both say it. And so they immediately take Naboth outside the city and they stone him. And then they send a message back to Jezebel. Naboth has been stoned and he's dead. And so Jezebel then goes into Ahab, who's still sulking in his bedroom. She's like, get up, get dressed, take a shower. Not in that order. Eat some food. And then I want you to go to the property that was Naboth's, and I want you to take it because Naboth is dead. That's yours now. And she gives him, in his name, this vineyard because Naboth is no more. That family is gone. She doesn't care about nor respect the rights of the family, the rights of possession, because by right, even though Naboth is dead, there were other members of his family that were entitled to that property who could have redeemed that property, but she wasn't interested in that. Figure if the king shows up and takes possession of it, and possession being 9/10 the law, right, that this is just his. And who's going to argue? We've already seen what the king's willing to do, because it was in the king's name that the elders acted. Well, God is not unaware of this. God is also not thrilled by this. And so he sends Elijah to find Ahab. And the reason he sends Elijah to find Ahab is because Ahab is not where he should be. Not so much about who he should be, but it's about where he should be. Ahab belonged in his palace. That's where he should be. Ahab most certainly should not have been in Naboth's home. And so he was not in the right place. He was not where he should be. And so God sends Elijah to find him. So 1 Kings chapter 21 and verse 17, the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who lives in Samaria. There he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone down to take possession of it. And so Elijah goes down to Jezreel, and he goes to meet Ahab here in this vineyard. Now, Ahab and Elijah already have history together, and it's not good history. And Elijah is going to execute his prophetic office to confront the king, to tell the king that the king is wrong. How many of you think this is going to go well? Just a cordial meeting between two old acquaintances, right? Not so much. They dispense with pleasantries right off. Verse 20, so Ahab said to Elijah, Have you found me, O my enemy? Like, let's not even pretend we like each other. And Elijah, answered, I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. You want to get right to business? We'll get right to business. Elijah delivers the message that God had given him for Ahab. It wasn't a good message. In fact, it was a message of doom. It was a message of, Ahab, your life is upon you. Ahab, your reign is coming to an end. Your posterity, your children, your dynasty is at an end. God has seen all the wickedness that you have done, and he is done with your wickedness. Furthermore, the message continues, the dogs that licked the blood from Naboth, who was murdered, those same dogs are going to eat the body of your wife. Now, this is tremendous disrespect. You think about it, a corpse being eaten is, aside from unpleasant, and you have a little bit of time to forget this before you serve dinner, is just a disrespect for a person. That she was literally just going to be cast out, not even buried, not attended to, and dogs were going to eat her body. I mean, we think of dogs as like domesticated little things. Try to think more in the terms of a jackal, like a pack of wild dogs that are just replicating, who have no known breed, and they're really like 2-foot tall rodents. Because that's kind of how dogs were in Israel. Dogs were not deemed, pets like we think of them today. They weren't even like functional hunting things. They were a menace. They were rodents. They were a threat to just civilization. You would kill them. You wouldn't keep them. And Elijah says, dogs are going to eat the body of your wife. And every one of your posterity, Ahab, who dies in the city, are likewise going to be eaten by dogs. And every one of your posterity that dies in the field, they're going to be eaten by birds. Not only is God done with you, but even in death, your family and your children are not going to be accorded any respect. They're going to die suddenly, and they're going to be consumed viciously. And there will be no memory, there will be no gravestone, there will be no civility, no nicety. Just violence and disrespect and consumption that you deserve. Now, how does Ahab respond? And this is most fascinating to me. Because Ahab is, I don't even have the right word to describe Ahab, because he is just that wicked. But notice in verse 27, 1 Kings chapter 1 and verse 27. So it was, when Ahab heard those words, that he tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his body, and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went about mourning. Does that strike you as an odd response? This isn't a king who's pouting. This is a king who's repenting. This is so far out of character for Ahab, who never regretted, who never seemed sorry about anything that he said, anything that he did, anything that was done in his name. He was declared several times by God to be the worst king Israel ever had, the most wicked king that Israel ever had, a guy who had exceeded all those who went before him or who would ever follow him in wickedness. But here in this moment, the recipient of this message, Ahab, begins to mourn. He rends his clothes. He puts on sackcloth. And he begins to repent. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, See how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the calamity in his days. In the days of his son, I will bring the calamity on his house. Though Elijah was singularly wicked, though Ahab was singularly wicked, Elijah's the good guy. Wearing the gray hat, because he was the good guy, but he was capable of extreme violence. Though Ahab was wicked, something in this chain of events, in the outright cold-blooded, framed-up murder of Naboth, the gifting of his vineyard, the challenge of Elijah the prophet, who found him because he was not where he should be. Something in this finally caught Ahab's heart, and he repented. I find that extraordinary. That God would spend so much ink in his word to tell us how bad Ahab was, but not forget to tell us that Ahab repented and that God relented. What does that say about any person you know or meet, or maybe are, as you hear these words? Nobody has gone so far that God will not extend forgiveness to them. Nobody has done anything that God is not willing to forgive. Ahab had committed stone-cold premeditated murder, had abused his office as king. He had set up altars and temples to other gods across Israel, had caused the people to stop worshiping God and start worshiping idols. He wasn't just wicked, he was actively wicked. He was intentionally evil. And yet God still extended to him the opportunity for forgiveness. Who can God not forgive? There's only one person that God cannot forgive. That's the person who won't receive forgiveness. When you stand there and say, "Oh, God won't forgive me," you're right. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He won't forgive you because you wouldn't receive it. But to all who receive forgiveness, they will find it. And so we find here this fascinating story, these two stories of Elijah being sent to find. And we see here two aspects to being found. The first one we saw with Elisha, that Elijah was sent to discover someone who was not what they could be. And then in Ahab, we see Elijah having to locate someone who is not where they should be. Very different in some respects, except that both required a finding. Both required somebody to go find them. One who just awaited opportunity. One who God said, "You could be so much more. I just need somebody to go find you and bring you to that place where you can be so much more." One who should not have been where he was and needed somebody to challenge him on that. But both required Elijah to get up and to go find somebody. So we see these two facets of being found. We're going to leave the story here. But let me encourage you this. If God sends somebody to find you, allow yourself to be found. That's really the lesson we see in this. If God sends somebody to find you, allow yourself to be found. Ahab did not want to be found, but he actually allowed himself to be found. He wasn't where he should be, and Elijah challenged him on that, and he actually repented of it. He allowed himself to be found. Elisha wasn't where he could be, and he allowed himself to be found. The finding requires an act of will on our parts to say, "Yes, I will allow myself to be found. I will become who I could be, or I will stop being where I should not be." You may be sitting here this morning going, "Pastor, I feel like at this moment in my life, I'm exactly who I should be, who I can be, and I'm exactly where I should be." You know what that makes you? It makes you the finder. It makes you Elijah in this sense. And so the lesson to you is, when God puts on your heart or in your path somebody that he wants found, go find them. Draw them to who they could be and where they should be. But most of us, at various points in our life, find ourselves about a bit where we shouldn't be, or not a bit who we could be. So we need to allow ourselves to be found. And then if we're found, remember that it's found people who find people. Find the people around you that God wants you to find. They're not who they could be, but maybe they will be because you found them. They're not where they should be, but maybe they will be because you went and found them. So whichever foot that shoe is on, whether you're the finder or whether you're the found, it's within us to choose. Will I allow myself to be found? And sometimes the harder role that Elijah played, will I go find those whom God is directing me toward? They will never be who they should be or where they should be if you don't. And so the mission is ours. We could be Elijah, we could be Elisha, we could be Ahab. Be the finder, be the found. Either way, cooperate in the process. Father, we love you. We thank you for Elijah's story. Father, I'm so thankful that Elijah was willing to go look, go find the people that you put on his heart. We would not have the stories of Elisha if Elijah hadn't gone to find him. And we would never see the great story of repentance in Ahab had Elijah not gone to find him. And so, Father, if we are this morning who and where we should be, would you help us to see our role as finders? But Father, if we are not this morning who we could be, and we are not this morning where we should be, would you help us to allow ourselves to be found? To repent, to re-enter relationship with you, to latch on to some vision that you have for us that is greater than the vision we have for ourselves. Help us to allow to be found. Father, we're thankful for Elijah. We're thankful for our church family. That we can come and we can participate in the services we've done today. Would you draw us closer to yourself, closer to each other, and closer to the world around us who needs us to go find them. We thank you in Jesus' good name.